You know what's funny about buying your dream home? The moment other people find out about it, people who never believed in you, people who laughed at you, people who told you that you'd amount to nothing, they suddenly want a piece of it. Not just to visit. Not just to sit on the deck and have a drink. They want ownership. My parents stood in the kitchen of my beach house, the kitchen with the $34,000 Calicut marble counters. I remember the cold feel of that stone under my hands and thinking, I finally made it. Only for my mother to treat it like a family inheritance before the mortgage papers were even dry. And my mother looked at me and said, and I quote, "Elias, this should really be a family property." And my father nodded, the way he always nods when my mother says something that's actually insane, like she's just made a perfectly reasonable observation about the weather. My father didn't even look at the ocean. He was busy looking for the property lines so he could figure out how much he could claim. I was 34 years old. I had built 3 businesses from nothing. I had slept on an air mattress in a studio apartment for 2 years to save money. I had skipped vacations, driven a 2009 Honda Civic with a broken AC, eaten meal prep chicken and rice for so long that I genuinely forgot what restaurant food tasted like. And these 2 people, who had more money than they would ever need, who had a 4-bedroom house in Connecticut, a condo in Florida, and a vacation fund that would make most people cry, wanted my house. So I smiled. I nodded. I said, you know what? Let's talk about that. And then I spent the next 6 weeks building the most expensive, most satisfying, most legally airtight trap 2 greedy people have ever walked into. Stay with me. This one's long. But I promise, every single minute is worth it. Let me back up, because you need to understand who my parents are before you understand why I did what I did. My father, Richard, is a corporate attorney. Retired now. Made a very comfortable living, never let anyone forget it. My mother, Diane, is what I describe as a professional socialite. Charity galas, country club lunches, a social calendar that she manages with the intensity of a military operation. They are not poor. They are not struggling. I want to be crystal clear about that. My parents have a net worth that I'd estimate, conservatively, at around $4 million. They have investments, they have property, they have a financial advisor named Gerald who they treat better than they ever treated me. And yet, somehow, I was always the problem. I didn't go to law school. That was strike 1. I dropped out of my MBA program after 1 semester to start my first business, a small logistics consulting firm that, I'll be honest, almost killed me financially before it finally turned a corner. That was strike 2, 3, and 4. My father sat across from me at Thanksgiving when I was 26. I can still smell my mother's overcooked turkey and the specific brand of judgment in that dining room, and he said, "Elias, I don't know what you're doing, but you need to have a backup plan." Real men have backup plans. I told him the business was the plan. He laughed. Not a mean laugh. Almost worse, a pitying laugh. Over the next few years, every family dinner had a version of the same conversation. How was the little company going? Had I thought about going back to school? Did I know that Marcus Chen, who I went to high school with, was already a junior partner at some firm in Manhattan? My mother once told her friend Carol, while I was standing 10 feet away at a Christmas party, that she worried about me because I'd never had a real job. I had 12 employees at the time. I just smiled, refreshed my drink, and walked away. That's what I always did. I walked away. I built. I kept my head down. And then, 3 years later, the logistics firm got acquired. Then I started a second company, SaaS product, B2B, boring but lucrative. Then a third. By the time I was 33, I had more money than I knew what to do with. And what I wanted to do with some of it, what I had wanted since I was a kid driving past the shore with my face pressed to the car window, was buy a house on the beach. So I did. 4 bedrooms. 3.5 baths. A wraparound deck that faces the Atlantic. Located in a small, genuinely beautiful town on the North Carolina Outer Banks, the kind of place where the sand is so pale it looks white, and the salt air hits you the second you step out of the car, and you can hear the waves from every room in the house because I specifically paid extra for that orientation when I bought the lot. The house cost $1.2 million. I paid cash. The marble counters, Calacatta gold, for anyone who wants to Google it, cost $34,000. I stood in that kitchen the day they were installed and I just stood there for probably 5 minutes, doing nothing, just existing in a space that was mine. And then I made the mistake of telling my parents about it. I invited them down for a long weekend. Labor Day. I figured, new chapter, maybe. I'm 34, successful by any reasonable measure, maybe we can just be adults who enjoy a nice house on the ocean together. My mother cried when she saw it. I thought it was genuine emotion. I was wrong, I'd figure that out later, but in the moment, I felt something I hadn't felt around my parents in years. Something that might have been hope. We had dinner on the deck the first night. I grilled. The waves were maybe 30 yards from the railing, and you could hear them underneath the conversation, this constant low sound like the ocean is breathing. I had a nice bottle of wine. My father actually complimented the house twice. My mother talked about how much her friends would love it. That should have been the signal. I missed it. The next morning, my father was at the kitchen counter when I came downstairs. He was drinking coffee, looking out at the water, and he had this expression on his face that I recognized from every negotiation of my entire life with this man. He looked settled. Like he'd already decided something and was just waiting to announce it. My mother came in a few minutes later. She sat down. And they did the thing they always do, where my father starts and my mother reinforces, like a relay race where the baton is condescension. My father said, "Elias, we've been talking. This house is remarkable. You've done well." I said thank you. He said, "But a house like this, it's a lot for one person. And we've been thinking that it would make a lot of sense, from a family perspective, to put this into a shared property arrangement." I said, "What does that mean?" My mother jumped in. She said, "It means family. It means the house is an asset for all of us. We'd want to use it, obviously. Carol and Tom have been looking for somewhere to host a proper beach weekend and this would be perfect, and we could work out a schedule." I said, "A schedule?" My father said, "We'd want to be on the deed, Elias. That's just how family property works." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "Dad, I paid $1.2 million for this house. I paid cash. My name is on the deed." He nodded, that same nod, and said, "Which is exactly why this is the right time to restructure. Before it gets complicated. Before there are tax implications." And then he said the thing. The thing I've been thinking about ever since. He said, "Look, you've been lucky, Elias. That's great. But luck runs out. And when it does, you're going to want your family in your corner. This is how you make sure of that. Luck. 12 years of 70-hour weeks. 3 businesses. Every sacrifice I'd made while they went to their country club and their charity galas. And to him it was luck." I looked at my mother. She was nodding. She was already mentally hosting Carol and Tom on my deck. And something in me, I don't know how to describe it exactly, something just went completely quiet. Not angry. Not loud. Just quiet. I said, "Okay. Let me think about it." And they smiled. They actually smiled. Because they had never once in 34 years considered that I might be better at strategy than my father. Here's what I need to ask you right now, because I want you to really sit with this. If your parents, people who had every advantage, who had never struggled a day of their adult lives, tried to take the thing you worked hardest for and dress it up as family, what would you do? Would you keep the peace? Would you smile, hand over what they wanted, and tell yourself it's fine because they're family? Or would you burn the bridge? Because I chose the bridge. And I am not even a little bit sorry. If you would too, hit subscribe. Because the rest of this story is exactly what burning that bridge looks like. Here's what most people don't understand about revenge. If you do it hot, if you do it angry, in the moment, loud, you lose. You always lose. Because hot revenge is just reaction, and reaction is almost always a mistake. Cold revenge is different. Cold revenge is architecture. You build it carefully, check every joint, make sure everything holds weight before you let anyone walk on it. I had about 6 weeks to build mine. The first call I made was to my attorney, a woman named Sandra who I've worked with for years and who, when I explained the situation, laughed for about 4 seconds and then got very professionally calm and said, "Okay, tell me exactly what you want the outcome to be." The outcome I wanted, my parents to permanently, legally, in writing, relinquish any claim to my estate. Not just the beach house. Everything. Any future contest of a will. Any future, family arrangement. Done. Sandra said she could build that. But I needed a mechanism, a reason for them to sign something that looked like it was in their interest. That's where my friend Derek came in. Derek is, how do I put this, Derek has done well in private equity. He looks expensive. He sounds expensive. He has exactly the kind of energy that impresses people like my father, who mistake confidence and a nice watch for credibility. I also called a woman named Priya, who I had worked with on a commercial real estate project, who knew more about structural engineering and property law in coastal zones than anyone I've ever met. And then I called a production company. Small outfit, does corporate video and training films, but they've got actors on call who can play basically anything. Because here's what I was going to build. I was going to let my parents have the house for a weekend, a real weekend, they'd be thrilled, and during that weekend, they were going to discover that I was in serious financial trouble. Not just any trouble. Federal trouble. A fictitious tax liability tied to the property's acquisition, something complex enough that my father, the attorney, would feel smart for understanding it. And the only way to save the house from federal seizure, and, by extension, to save their weekends with Carol and Tom, would be for them to sign a document restructuring the property arrangement. Which would actually be a document relinquishing any claim to my estate. Legal? Entirely. Sandra built it herself. Ethical? That's a different conversation. But my parents had spent 34 years being strategically unethical with their children's emotions, so I was comfortable with where the needle pointed. Here's how we built it. I called my mother and told her that I'd been thinking about what they said, and that I thought they were right. That family was important. That I wanted to make things work. She was so pleased she called me twice in the next week, once to tell me Carol was excited, once to confirm the dates. I gave them Columbus Day weekend. 4 nights. I had the house prepared. In the second bedroom, the one with the best ocean view, the one I knew my mother would claim, I had a small but very visible crack introduced into the ceiling plaster around one of the recessed lights. Cosmetic. Completely cosmetic. But it looked, to an untrained eye, like a structural settling issue. The kind of thing that, in a coastal zone, can sometimes flag a property for inspection. I had Priya draft, on official-looking letterhead from a fictitious coastal property compliance firm, an inspection notice. The notice indicated that the property had been flagged under a North Carolina coastal zone compliance review for potential structural irregularities related to the foundation and the original construction permits. This was all fake. I want to be completely clear about that. The house is structurally perfect. I had it fully inspected before purchase. But the letter looked real, and more importantly, it sounded like exactly the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that would give a retired attorney the urge to handle something. Derek prepared a document, again, entirely fictitious, that outlined a tax liability attached to the property acquisition. The story we constructed was that my business had been flagged in a broader IRS review of cash real estate transactions over $1 million. The liability was $800,000. The suggestion from my fictional accountants was that restructuring the property as a family asset would complicate the IRS's ability to pursue it as a personal holding. This is not how tax law actually works. But it sounds like how tax law works to someone who practiced corporate law 30 years ago and has been retired for 10. My father would feel like he was seeing through the complexity when he was actually just seeing what we wanted him to see. Sandra drafted the actual document my parents would sign. On the surface, it appeared to be exactly what my father would propose, a family property trust restructuring that would theoretically protect the asset from federal seizure. In reality, buried in legally precise but deliberately dense language, the document did two things. It confirmed my sole ownership of the beach house in perpetuity, and it included a comprehensive estate renunciation clause that prevented my parents from contesting my will or making any future legal claim to any portion of my estate. Sandra had a colleague, a semi-retired judge she knew, review the document. His note back was, "This isn't a contract, Elias. It's a cage. And your parents are going to walk right into it because they think they're the ones holding the key." He wasn't wrong. Everything was in place. I hired 2 actors for one afternoon. One played a representative from the fictional coastal compliance firm, showing up to discuss the inspection notice. One played my personal accountant, arriving to urgently discuss the tax situation. I briefed both of them for 2 hours. They were professionals. They didn't blink. Everything was in place by the Thursday before Columbus Day. My parents arrived Friday at noon. My mother walked in the front door, looked around, and said, "Oh, it's even better than I remembered." I made them lunch. I was so warm, so generous, so apparently at peace with the whole arrangement that my father actually clapped me on the shoulder at one point and said, "This is good, Elias. This is how it should be." I smiled and poured him more iced tea. They spent Friday afternoon on the deck. I watched them from the kitchen window, my mother already on the phone with Carol, my father looking out at the water with this expression of complete satisfaction, and I felt something that I want to be honest about. For about 4 minutes, I felt sad. Because in a parallel version of this story, this is just a nice weekend. Parents visit. Everyone is happy. The beach house becomes something good in the family, a place people gather, something that replaces all the years of criticism and condescension with something real. But that's not what they were doing. They weren't visiting. They were acquiring. And the difference matters. So I let the 4 minutes pass, and I went back to being warm. Friday night was uneventful. I cooked. The waves were loud enough that night that you could hear them from the dinner table through the closed glass doors, this low, rhythmic push and pull that should have been relaxing and was, for me, because I had everything exactly where I needed it. Saturday morning, I casually mentioned that I'd received some paperwork from a compliance firm about the property. My father's ears came up immediately. Retired or not, attorneys never stop being attorneys. He asked to see it. I handed him the letter from Priya's fictional firm. He read it twice. I watched him go through all the stages, confusion, then comprehension, then concern, then the slightly hungry look that comes over him when he thinks there's a problem to solve. "Elias, this is serious. Coastal zone compliance issues can flag a property for forced sale. This is not something you handle yourself." I said, "I know. I've been stressed about it." My mother looked alarmed. My father said, "Who's your property attorney?" I gave him a name. Fictional firm. Sandra had set up a voicemail. He said, "I'll make some calls Monday. In the meantime, don't panic." And then, right on schedule, because Derek was operating on my text signal, my phone rang. I looked at it, apologized, and stepped inside to take the call. I stayed on the phone for 8 minutes. I walked back and forth in the kitchen in a way that was visible through the glass. I ran my hand through my hair twice, a tell I actually have when I'm stressed, and my mother knows it. When I came back to the deck, I sat down and was quiet for a moment. My father said, "What was that?" I said, "My accountant." There might be a situation with the acquisition. The IRS flagged cash transactions over $1 million in my company's last 2 years, and the beach house purchase is in the window. I watched them process this. My father said, "What kind of liability are we talking about?" I said, "He mentioned $800,000. But it's preliminary." My mother said, "Oh, Elias." The way she said it, I want to be careful here, it wasn't malicious in that moment. She was genuinely worried. But she was worried about the house. Not about me. There's a difference, and I heard it clearly. My father was already in attorney mode. He said, "Here's the thing. If this property is restructured as a family trust before any formal IRS action, it changes the exposure significantly. This is actually the right time to do exactly what we discussed." And there it was. He wasn't offering to help me. He was offering to help himself, using my crisis as the justification. I said, "You think the family trust idea would actually help?" He said, "Elias, I've been doing this for 40 years. Yes. It helps. And it needs to happen before Monday." Sunday morning, Derek arrived. He played the accountant beautifully. He had a leather portfolio, a very expensive watch, and the slightly harried energy of someone managing a complex situation across multiple clients. He sat at my Calacatta gold marble kitchen counter and walked my parents through the entirely fabricated liability in detail, using enough real terminology that my father nodded along, and at one point actually corrected Derek on a minor point of tax procedure, which Derek graciously accepted. The setup was working exactly because my father needed to feel smarter than the accountant. And we had let him. Derek laid out the document. He explained that it was a family property restructuring agreement that would, in his professional assessment, significantly reduce the IRS's avenue for seizure by distributing ownership across family members. My father picked it up. He read it. He asked 3 clarifying questions, which Sandra had anticipated and I had prepped Derek to answer. He made a small note in the margin. He looked at my mother. She said, "If this protects the house, then it's the right thing." My father nodded. He said, "Elias, I want you to know, this is what family does. This is what I was trying to explain last month." I looked at him. I said, "I know, Dad. Thank you." He signed. My mother signed. I signed. Derek collected the documents, shook hands, left. My parents spent the rest of Sunday afternoon in very good spirits, my father in the particular mood he gets when he's solved something, my mother already back on the phone with Carol, the whole situation reframed in their minds as the moment they had ridden in and saved me. I grilled dinner. The sunset that night was the kind that makes you stop talking, orange and red across the water, the ocean completely flat and the waves small and rhythmic, and we sat on the deck together and watched it. My father said, "This is a good house, Elias." I said, "Yeah. It is." Monday morning, I made breakfast. The full thing, eggs, bacon, fresh coffee, the kind of morning that feels like a gift when you're at the beach. We were almost done eating when Sandra arrived. I had told my parents she was stopping by to handle some paperwork follow-up. She came in, set her bag down at the kitchen counter, and placed 2 copies of a document in front of them. My father reached for it. He read it for about 45 seconds before I saw his face change. Not angry. Not immediately. First confused. Then, as the legalese resolved itself into meaning, something that I can only describe as a controlled implosion. He said, "Elias. What is this?" I said, "That's the document you signed yesterday." He said, "This is not a property trust." I said, "No. It's not." Sandra stepped in, professionally and calmly, and explained that the document was a valid, witnessed, and entirely legal estate renunciation agreement. That by signing, my parents had confirmed my sole, permanent, unconditional ownership of the beach house. And that the secondary clause, the one my father had not focused on, because he'd been focused on the tax liability framing, constituted a legal waiver of any claim to my estate in any future proceeding. My mother said, "I don't understand." My father said, quietly, which is how I knew it had landed, "There was no IRS problem, was there?" I said, "No." He said, "The inspection notice?" I said, "Also no." The silence lasted probably 15 seconds. The waves were audible from the kitchen. The salt air was coming through the screen door I'd left open, the way it always does in the morning at that house, that specific coastal smell that I'd grown up dreaming about and spent 12 years earning. My father said, "You tricked us." And I said, and I want to be very precise about this, because I had thought about how to say it for 6 weeks, "You didn't come here to save my house, Dad. You came here to scavenge. You saw a shark in the water and didn't realize it was your own son, and that I'd been watching you the whole time." "No, Dad. I showed you who you are. You sat in my house, the house you once told me luck might not let me keep, and the moment you thought I was in trouble, your first move wasn't to protect me. It was to get your name on the deed. You used my crisis as leverage to take something from me. The only difference between what you tried to do and what I actually did is that I was honest about it afterward." My father started to say something. I said, "Sandra will walk you through the implications of the document. There's nothing illegal here. There's nothing to contest. I'll give you some privacy." I walked out to the deck. I stood at the railing and looked at the water for a while. They left that afternoon. My mother didn't say goodbye. She walked past me on her way to the car and looked at me the way she might look at someone she'd never met. My father stopped at the door, and for a moment I thought he might actually say something real. Something true. He said, "You didn't have to do it this way." I said, "You didn't have to try to take my house." He nodded. He left. I haven't spoken to them since. That was 8 months ago. People ask me if I feel guilty. I'll be straight with you, no. Not because I'm not capable of guilt, but because guilt requires me to believe I did something wrong, and I don't. I built something for myself. I protected it. I just used the same tools they used on me for 30 years, strategy, patience, and a very clear understanding of what the other person actually wanted. The beach house is mine. Unambiguously. Permanently. The Calacatta gold counters are still perfect. The deck still faces the Atlantic. The waves are still audible from every room. And every morning I make coffee in that kitchen and stand at the window and look at the water, I feel something that it took me a long time to name. It's not victory. It's not even satisfaction, exactly. It's just mine. If you made it to the end of this, thank you. You know what to do: subscribe, share this if someone you know needs to hear it, and drop a comment telling me, was there a line I should have drawn? Or did I draw it exactly right? I'll see you in the next one.